Nobody told her not to go. That was the first mistake. On the morning of July 27, 2025, Ursula von der Leyen boarded a plane to Scotland, not to a summit, not to a diplomatic conference, not to any of the grand institutions that Europe had spent decades building to handle exactly this kind of moment. She flew to a golf course owned by Donald Trump. And by the time she landed, everyone in Brussels already knew what the headlines would say. The only question was how bad the damage would be. This is the story of the most consequential trade meeting in European history. How it happened, what von der Leyen agreed to, and why the people closest to her are now asking a question nobody dared ask 12 months ago. Was this a deal? Or was it a surrender? Ursula von der Leyen had spent her entire career building a reputation above all others: toughness. She had survived German politics, Brussels bureaucracy, a pandemic, a war on European soil, and 2 years of Trump's opening threats. She had stood on stages across Europe and told leaders, businesses, and ordinary citizens the same thing. Europe would not be bullied. Europe would not bend. Europe had leverage, and she knew how to use it. For months in early 2025, she had meant every word. When Trump first announced his sweeping global tariffs in April, the European Commission responded within days. Countermeasures were prepared. Legal challenges were filed. The EU's anti-coercion instrument, a powerful tool that could effectively close the European market to American companies, was placed on the table. Von der Leyen told reporters Europe was ready for every scenario. Then Trump moved the deadline. He had originally set tariffs at 10% for most of the world. But when his own trade officials negotiated a preliminary framework with Brussels, he rejected it. Personally, he sent a letter threatening to raise EU tariffs to 30%. Not 15, not 20, 30, on everything. Cars, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, wine, machinery, $1.7 trillion in annual trade. He gave Europe a new deadline, August 1st, and this time, he said, there would be no extensions, no grace periods. The number 30 changed everything in Brussels. European carmakers ran the calculations overnight. German manufacturers, French pharmaceutical companies, Dutch exporters. The numbers were catastrophic. A 30% tariff on European goods entering the American market would cost the continent hundreds of billions. It would trigger factory closures. It would cost jobs. It would hand Trump the economic war he had been threatening since January. And so von der Leyen made a decision. She would go to him. Not to Washington, not to the White House, to Turnberry, to his golf resort on the west coast of Scotland, where Trump had been playing golf with his sons for 3 days, in between meetings with European leaders who had come, one by one, to show their respect. Von der Leyen flew in with a small team, her chief trade negotiator, Maros Sefcovic, her cabinet chief, Björn Seibert, a handful of advisors. They knew going in that the outcome was uncertain, 50-50 at best. Trump was unpredictable. Their personal relationship was thin. He had humiliated other leaders in similar settings. There was every chance she would walk out with nothing. She did not walk out with nothing. She walked out with something arguably worse. The deal announced on July 27, 2025, set a 15% tariff on most EU exports to the United States. That sounds like a victory. It was half the 30% Trump had threatened. But here is what the headline number hid. In exchange for that 15%, the European Union agreed to accept American goods with zero tariffs. Zero? The largest economy in the world, 450 million consumers, the richest market on Earth, is open completely to American products. No duties, no protections, nothing. The Trade Committee chair in the European Parliament, a man who had spent years defending European commercial interests, called it a symmetry set in stone. He used another word, too. He called it a misery, and the tariffs were only the beginning. Von der Leyen also committed Europe to purchasing $750 billion worth of $150 billion worth of American energy exports over the next 3 years. $750 billion. For context, total American energy exports in 2024 were worth $332 billion. She had $132 billion. She had committed Europe to buying more American energy than America had ever sold to the entire world. Critics immediately asked the obvious question: where was that number coming from? How was it possible? Von der Leyen's team said it included existing European energy purchases, redirected contracts, and new agreements. Analysts said it was a pledge designed to impress Trump, not a number that could ever be fully delivered. There was more. She also announced that the EU would invest $600 billion in the American economy. $600 billion flowing from Europe to the United States at exactly the moment Europe needed capital to rebuild its own defense industry, its own technology sector, its own economic base. French Prime Minister François Bayrou used one word to describe the deal: submission. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, one of Europe's most powerful leaders, said the agreement would cause considerable damage to both economies. He signed on because the alternative was worse, but he made clear he was not celebrating. Back in Brussels, something unusual happened. The European Parliament, which almost never acts this quickly on trade matters, moved to block the deal. Lawmakers from across the political spectrum argued von der Leyen had exceeded her mandate, that she had given away too much, that she had walked into Turnberry prepared only to say yes, which made Trump's demands inevitable. One senior analyst put it plainly: she blinked, and when she blinked, Trump took everything he could reach. There is a version of events where von der Leyen is the hero of this story. In that version, she avoided a 30% tariff catastrophe. She saved European jobs. She kept $1.7 trillion in annual trade flowing between the two largest economies on Earth. She made an impossible decision in an impossible situation and chose the least bad option available to her. That version is not wrong. It is just incomplete, because what happened after Scotland matters as much as what happened in Scotland. Trump kept moving. Within weeks of the Turnberry handshake, his administration began expanding 50% tariffs on European steel and aluminum to hundreds of additional products. Products that were supposed to be covered by the deal. Products that von der Leyen's team believed were settled. The European Commission sent urgent messages to Washington. The Americans said the deal was a framework, not a final agreement, that negotiations were ongoing, that nothing was locked in. Then came Greenland. In January 2026, Trump threatened economic warfare against EU member states that had participated in a NATO exercise near Greenland, countries that had sent troops to defend the alliance's territory. He threatened to tear up the Turnberry deal entirely. The European Parliament, already skeptical, moved to suspend approval of the legislation needed to implement the agreement. Manfred Weber, leader of the largest political group in the parliament, said approval was not possible. The deal that von der Leyen had staked her credibility on was collapsing in real time. She responded the way she always responds: publicly, firmly, with 4 words that became a headline across every European newspaper. A deal is a deal. It was a good line. It was the right line. But it raised a question that nobody in Brussels wanted to answer out loud. What happens when the other side disagrees? When they look at the same handshake, the same photograph on the golf course, the same joint statement, and simply decide the rules no longer apply? On March 26, 2026, the European Parliament finally voted to implement the trade agreement. The deal survived. Von der Leyen had her framework. Europe and America were still trading. The catastrophe of 30% tariffs had been avoided. But something had shifted. Something that does not appear in trade statistics, official statements, or parliamentary votes. The image of von der Leyen as the woman who could stand up to anyone, who would never be pressured into a bad deal, who had built a career on the word no, that image had quietly changed. Not shattered, not destroyed, but different. She had flown to his golf course, and she had come back with a deal that her own allies called a submission, that her own parliament tried to block, that her own trade officials were still arguing over months later. Was it the worst deal in EU history? Her defenders say no, her critics say yes. The truth, as it almost always is in European politics, sits somewhere in between. What is not in between is the question it leaves open. Because the Turnberry deal was not the end of this story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Europe knows something it did not fully know before July 27, 2025. Trump will always ask for more, and the question that will define von der Leyen's legacy is whether she has anything left to give. We are watching.